For anyone that is maybe familiar with addictions or what it means to struggle with an addiction, you may understand this quote all too well. One is too many, and 1,000 is never enough. One pill, one joint, one drink, one of whatever you're addicted to is too many, and yet 1,000 will never satisfy your cravings. I recently heard someone who had been addicted to drugs, and before he hit bottom, before he was ready to make a change in his life, he tried to figure out how many illegal drugs he could do while still functioning and kind of not being found out, functioning day to day. As I listened to him, I thought, that's a good representation of what we do with sin. How much sin can I embrace without ever really being found out? How much sin can I participate in before it affects my reputation? How can I put a spin on my sin so that others might actually view it as a virtue? Paul tells us about the universal problem of sin in Romans 3:23 when he says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." One is too many, and yet we do not actively seek after sin, but even then 1,000 is not enough. It seems that we continue to sin. The last 2 weeks we've been looking at different people's response to Jesus. On Easter Sunday we talked about the women who went to the tomb, and they were confused. They were broken. As they went to the tomb that morning, they were expecting to put spices on Jesus' dead body, and when they went there, they found that the tomb was empty. They thought someone had played a cruel joke on them, that someone had stolen the body away. But Jesus met them in the midst of their confusion and helped them to understand that the empty tomb was not a joke or a hoax, but rather it was a source of hope, because the tomb was empty because he was risen. Last week, Pastor Alex talked about Peter and Peter's confidence. Peter confidently proclaimed that God raised Jesus from the dead, and it was impossible for death to keep its hold on Jesus. Now, it's interesting to note that Peter was one of them that even went to the tomb on that first Easter morn. He went at the bidding of the women, and as he went, he saw that the tomb was empty. And on that Easter Sunday, his response was confusion, yet his confusion turned into confidence. Confidence of what God had done, and the power of God that was shown through Jesus' resurrection. Today we're going to look at another man's response to Jesus, and I think that this man's response to Jesus was that he wanted to be in control. He wanted to control God's message. He actually wanted to control God's message by seeking to silence it. This morning we're going to talk about Saul's conversion. Now, after his conversion, Saul's name was changed to Paul, and the Apostle Paul wrote a majority of the books in the New Testament. He wrote more books than any other author. Here's what we know about Saul. He came from pure Jewish descent. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. His father was a Pharisee. Saul was also a Pharisee. Now, the Pharisees were often in conflict with Jesus, and the Pharisees were concerned about the law. They were concerned that people follow the letter of the law. The Pharisees were very legalistic, and one of the reasons that they were often kind of batting heads with Jesus is because Jesus was more concerned about the individual than he was the letter of the law. Jesus talked more about grace, and grace was not something that the Pharisees were filled with. The date of Saul's birth is unknown, but scholars believe that he was born about 2 years after Jesus. So that would have meant that even though he may not have witnessed all of Jesus' life and ministry, he was at least familiar with it. He was probably in Jerusalem when when Jesus was arrested and was crucified. It's an issue that he would have been in his early 30s at this point, and it may have been Saul's concern for the law and Jesus' practice of grace that caused so much conflict between the Pharisees and the followers of Jesus. Well, the first mention of Saul comes in Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7, it's the story of Stephen, one of the leaders of the followers of Jesus, and Stephen is being stoned to death. And it says that there was a young man by the name of Saul who stood over the cloaks and the clothes of those who took off their outer garments as they put Saul to his death, or put Stephen to his death. Saul was there present watching. There was evidence to believe that Saul not only witnessed the death of Stephen, but he was also responsible for putting believers in jail, for persecuting them, for even putting them to death. Saul even indicates that in putting people to death, there were times when he cast a vote in favor of them being put to death. Saul even indicates that after his conversion, the disciples, the followers of Jesus, didn't fully trust him. They weren't sure what to think of him. They were afraid to let him in on some of their gatherings for fear he was just trying to infiltrate them and trick them in order that he might do them harm. After Stephen's death, Saul continued to persecute the church. And prior to Saul's conversion, he sought to control the message of Jesus by seeking to silence it. Saul was on a journey from Jerusalem to Damascus when God got his attention in a pretty spectacular way. And I want to read part of that to you. I'm going to begin with Acts chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. It says, "Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' Saul asked. 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. 'Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do.'